everybody, it's Mel. Thank you so much for joining me. Today's video is going to be a bit of a discussion video and kind of vlog style. We are talking about Trojan War retellings, so yeah, that's the plan. Myself and Paige from Pages with Paige and my friend Max have decided to do a little bit of a buddy read project where we're going to be reading a bunch of different books that are retellings of the Trojan War, specifically the Iliad, but the general different publications about the Trojan War. And we are discussing these. We have a chat group where the three of us have been talking about the books that we're reading, what we're feeling about them, what we think is interesting, not interesting, etc. I'm not 100% sure exactly what Paige is doing. I think she's doing more of a specific vlog and talking about the books kind of as she reads them. I decided that I was actually going to do, I guess it is sort of vlog style because you see me in different points, but it's more of a sit down video talking to you about our conversations and what we've been finding interesting. We'll also be doing kind of like a live show, but not live, but filmed and inserted into our videos as well, so you can hear each of us saying what we think about things in our own voices. So some background. Basically, I realised that I inadvertently have collected quite a few books that are retellings specifically of the Trojan War. So yes, I have quite a lot of Greek mythology retellings. I love Greek mythology retellings and I very much love Greek myths, so that's not surprising. But what I didn't realise was how many specifically Trojan War retellings I had collected. So I said something about this to Paige because Paige sent me the first book we're going to talk about, which is 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. Paige sent me that for a giveaway, I think it was, sometime last year, and that's sort of when I realised how many books I had. And I said something to her about wanting to do a little bit of a reading project and compare and contrast. She was very keen on the idea. And then I suggested to her that we include my friend Max, because Max is a classicist. She has a PhD in classics and she works at a classics lecturer at a university. So she very much knows what she's talking about. I know she's already read some of these books, but some of them she hasn't read yet. And she would have, I thought, an interesting perspective on the retelling aspect, how faithful they might be and whether they were achieving their aims. So I thought that would be a really interesting perspective to get. I did also study classics at university in my undergrad degree, which was quite a few years ago now. I actually met Max at university when we were both doing Latin. Anyway, I just thought it'd be really cool to get her perspective on things. So, throughout the month of January, Max had already read it, but Paige and I read 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. And I definitely have a different perspective of this book than I would have done had I not been talking to two other people about it and getting their perspective on it. Particularly, I will say Max, because she has that academic perspective, whereas Paige and I come from a more reader perspective. And it's not to say that Paige and I don't have some experience in the area, in the genre. We've both read a number of different Greek mythology retellings. We've both, I don't know whether Paige has, what Paige's university background is, but I think she has done at least a bit of classics at university, and I obviously have my undergrad degree, which was 20 years ago, so you know, it's old information now. But anyway, it was just interesting to get a very different perspective. So the first thing, I came into this book having spoken to Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany and Cara from Wild Book Garden about the project I was intending to do and talking about this being one of the books, and they were saying that they thought that given this is supposed to be a feminist retelling of the Iliad, that it was very centered around men, and that although a lot of the voices were women's, they were talking about men and centering the men's actions in the narrative. So I came to the book with that. Now, Max had quite a different perspective. Her perspective was that she feels that a lot of the discourse around modern feminist retellings of classic literature is very, for obvious reasons, very tainted, very coloured by feminism, particularly third-wave feminism, and by the perspectives of modern understanding of feminism. And there seems to be a general consensus among a lot of different people who are writing these sorts of books, probably not so much in a broader context in the academic study of classics, but certainly in the sort of oeuvre of people who are writing these sorts of books, so Natalie Haynes, Jennifer Saint, Madeline Miller, Pat Barker, I'm sure there are many, many others. Then it seems to be a perspective that, to a certain extent, women were not just non-feministly represented, but almost non-existent, and she felt like that was not at all true. So I probably should find the message. So what Max's message initially said is, so my issue was that in some of the interviews, etc., there was lots of talk about how Greek myth, particularly Homer, left out women and the women's perspective, and I actually think that's incorrect. And it erases the many girls and women characters who are there and who are vital to the plot, and whose psychology was explored at least to some extent in quite a few myths. She then goes on to say, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the Greek originals are feminist by any means, but they weren't as androcentric as some people now say. So that was early on in me reading 1,000 Ships, and I did notice that that was the case. So it was interesting to have the two different perspectives early on in reading it, because I did understand where Bethany and Cara were coming from. I could see that they certainly talk about the male perspective a lot, which is understandable. The Iliad is mostly from men's perspectives. However, Max does make an excellent point. That is that the implication, specifically from Natalie Haynes, maybe not so much from some of the other authors I've mentioned, but specifically from Natalie Haynes, seems to be that women are largely ignored and their perspectives aren't included in the original stories. That's not true. It's just not true. The Iliad, none of these books would really come up under any kind of modern feminist comprehension of the world, any modern feminist perspectives, but they don't not have women. In the Iliad, we explore Andromache's perspective quite a bit. We also look at Hera, and we do touch on Briseis as well. Now, like I said, I wouldn't call any of that feminist per se, but they're not absent like it is implied by Natalie Haynes. So I, like Max, ended up finding myself having that specific issue with 1,000 Ships. Now, I also have an issue with the sheer number of perspectives we do get in this book, because we do follow a number of women's perspectives. We follow the Trojan women, which is quite a few of the princesses, so the Hecuba, the wife of Priam, so the Queen of Troy, and a few of her daughters, including her daughter-in-law, Andromache, and including Cassandra. We follow the Muse, Calliope, we follow Penelope, we follow Briseis, we follow Creusa, we have a little bit of Paris's original wife, we follow the three goddesses, Athena, Aphrodite and Hera a little bit. So we just have so many different perspectives, and I feel like it was far too broad. We really couldn't dig down into, while we were given their perspectives, we really couldn't dig down into how it affected them and how their personalities and their psyches were affected by this 10-year long war. And yeah, I feel like I get where Bethany and Cara are coming from, that it focuses so much on the male perspective, even though it's through these women's perspective, because it's so shallow, basically, because it's so many different women that we don't get to see what's going on for them. We just get to see the story. We just get to see the action from their eyes. In some places that was interesting and it was well done, but for the most part it really wasn't. Yeah, it really just didn't get into anything specific. It didn't get into anything particularly deep. And I just feel like that really didn't do much for the narrative. It didn't do much for the idea of talking about the feminist perspective and giving women a voice. I think this is particularly obvious in Penelope's sections. For the most part, Penelope's sections are Penelope writing letters to Odysseus, talking about what she's heard from travelling bards and storytellers about Odysseus's travels home. So the story of the Odyssey, of his travels home from the Trojan War. But it's not, there's a little bit of this is what I've been going through, but it's barely that. It's mostly just, oh, I heard this was happening, did you think of me? Oh, I heard this was happening, did you think of me? And it just felt like Natalie Haynes was trying to be like, I didn't just read the Iliad, I read the Odyssey too. And that just felt really shallow. It didn't feel like there was any point to that. And then the sections of Calliope, the muse, where it's basically her inspiring Homer to write the Iliad, but she's trying to make him write a more feminist version of the Iliad and include the women's perspectives. So it feels like Natalie Haynes is saying, this is the version that Homer would have written had he listened to Calliope and included women's voices. This is the feminist Iliad, which is, I don't think, entirely fair to the original Iliad. Like I said, I wouldn't argue it was feminist, but I wouldn't necessarily argue this was super feminist either. Like, it gives women's perspectives, but doesn't give a feminist argument or a feminist take. It just, here's what was happening, but you're hearing about it from these women, if that makes sense. So this wasn't, I still enjoyed it. I still gave it, I think, 3 stars, because it was well written what it was doing, but I just don't think it was doing what it said it was doing. The other thing was that on the back of this, it talks about Natalie Haynes was awarded the Classical Association Prize for her work in bringing classics to a wider audience, which I assume is including this one. But I don't think it does that very well either, because there's such a large range of people and stories in this book that it's very surface level. And so you kind of already have to know a bit about it, which kind of defeats the purpose. I mean, this is definitely more readable than the Iliad. So if that's what you're going for, like a new women's feminist, more accessible version of the Iliad, then I guess that makes sense. But it includes some of the Odyssey as well, and I just don't think it really achieved what it set out to achieve particularly well. I think Paige had a slightly better view of it than I did. I was definitely swayed by Max's opinions. However, that is partly because I've known Max for a long time and we've talked about these sorts of things a lot, and we both know how the other person thinks. We know how to express things in a way that the other person's going to think, oh yeah, that makes sense. And we generally have similar opinions. Now, like I said, I do think Paige enjoyed it more than Max or myself. However, it definitely was an interesting conversation, and I feel that she definitely found it really interesting to talk with Max and I about it. But yeah, that is my thoughts on 1,000 Ships. That is the first book. It is the 15th of February today, and what my book for February is Electra by Jennifer Saint. Now, I absolutely loved Ariadne by Jennifer Saint, so I'm very excited to read Electra. I am looking forward to that one. I feel like it might be better. I might enjoy it better. So yeah, the next time you see me, I will be talking to you about Electra. But anyway, I guess I'll sign off now, and yeah, see you in a bit. Hi friends. So it is the 8th of March, and at the end of February I read Electra by Jennifer Saint. So this obviously is another Trojan War retelling. This one we follow 3 women, so rather than following many women, we follow just the 3. It is called Electra, obviously, although it doesn't follow just Electra. It follows Electra, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra. So we did have Cassandra's point of view in 1,000 Ships. Well, it wasn't really her point of view, but they did focus on Cassandra a little bit. There was a little bit of Clytemnestra, not very much, and there was nothing of Electra. So this is a little bit different from that in that regard. But also, I just thought this was a stronger book. I much preferred this one to 1,000 Ships. So I've already spoken to you all about what I thought about 1,000 Ships. So I'm going to try not to, this is a compare and contrast video a little bit, but I'm going to try not to do too much of the this is better because it didn't do what this did. But some of the reasons why I thought this was a stronger book. First of all, it focuses on those 3 characters, and you 100% get the Trojan War retelling, you 100% get facets of the Trojan War, of the action, of the effects, all of that, but you don't have to follow multiple people, so you still get that really great characterization. You still get really drilled into different characters' perspectives and feelings, rather than the 1,000 Ships, which I felt was way too surface level because it was following too many characters, and I didn't feel like you really got a proper sense of those characters' feelings. Whereas this one, because we had 3 main characters, we were much more able to get into some of their psyches. I feel like that makes this a stronger feminist retelling as well, because while the other one focused on female characters and female stories, because it was so surface level, you couldn't really get into the heart of why they were doing the things they were doing, what was making them act the way they were acting, how was the war affecting their lives. I mean, obviously it's good to have a female's perspective, it's good to see things from a woman's perspective, but I don't feel like doing that is enough to really give you that different perspective and that different understanding of war and of a situation and why certain things affect women in different ways, or, you know, affect women in a way that maybe isn't as obvious on the face of it, because, you know, you think about war and you think about the soldiers. So many people don't think about who's left behind, who is on the ground in the area but isn't in the fighting, how were they affected, etc. So I feel like this one did that a lot better. And by focusing on these 3 women, it was able to really give an understanding of the various different effects that war can have on various different people for different reasons. So the Natalie Haynes book focused on, okay, this is the war, and let me talk about how women were represented in the war, and because of the inclusion of, is it Calliope or Calypso? I always mix up those names for some reason, but the muse trying to convince the poet, who I assume is supposed to be Homer, to write a more feminist retelling. It felt like Natalie Haynes was sort of saying, hey, I'm going to do a better job than Homer. Which isn't to say that people couldn't do a better job than Homer of making a feminist retelling, but I didn't appreciate the hubris of that one, of that attempt. Whereas this one I felt was a lot more, I didn't feel like this had that same level of arrogance. I felt like this one was legitimately trying to tell a story rather than prove a point or make an example of. So yeah, I definitely preferred this one. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. So it does say on the back that it is focusing on the House of Atreus. So it's focusing on Agamemnon and Menelaus, who are the brothers, and it is focusing on their house, but it's focusing more on Agamemnon rather than Menelaus. So it is a Trojan War retelling, but it doesn't focus on the war itself in as much as a lot of other Trojan War retellings, and in fact the Iliad does itself. because it focuses on Clytemnestra and Electra rather than Helen. So this book actually starts with Clytemnestra, and we start well before the Trojan War, well before any hint that the war was going to happen. We start when Helen, who is Clytemnestra's sister, was being wooed by many different suitors. There was a whole bunch of them all gathered in Sparta, and they all decided that they would band together and they would form an oath to say that whoever it was that ended up winning Helen's love and her hand in marriage, they would come to his aid at any point that it was needed. So anyway, Helen ends up choosing Menelaus, who is the brother of Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae. Mycenae was the most powerful Greek city-state at the time. Clytemnestra the brother marries Agamemnon, and she moves to Mycenae, whereas Menelaus moves to Sparta and lives with Helen in Sparta. And then we are following Clytemnestra as everything with Helen happened, and she ran away with Paris, ran off to Troy, and Menelaus and Agamemnon are gathering the Greek armies and the Greek kings to go and fight this war on Menelaus's behalf and to get Helen back. But also Agamemnon just wants to be the most powerful king. He wants everyone to follow him. He's in theory the most powerful because it's the biggest city-state, has the most financial trade power, but this is kind of going to be the proof of that. In order to be able to go to Troy and have the gods bless their attack, their campaign, Agamemnon is told to do something that is really horrific, and it has a very serious effect on his wife Clytemnestra, who is consumed with wanting to get revenge on Agamemnon for most of her life, which adversely affects her daughter Electra. So it's a conversation about those two characters, about revenge, about anger, about the effects of what your parents do and how that affects you and your psyche and your upbringing and your development, the effects of not just the war itself, but all aspects of what it takes to bring about a war on women, on the people that stay behind. But we also have the inclusion of Cassandra. Now, Cassandra was both a princess of Troy, but also the priestess of Apollo. According to the Iliad and every retelling that I've come across, the Trojans who lived in Asia Minor, Troy is in Asia, or was in Asia Minor, the Trojans worship the Greek gods. Now, Max and I would love to see a retelling where they don't worship the Greek gods and they worship the Asia Minor gods, or she did say, I can't remember, but Max has said what they would be called. Let me see if I can find that. Phrygian, I think? I haven't found it, but I'm remembering. The Phrygian gods. Correct me if I'm saying that wrong, but we haven't come across that, but that would be very cool. Anyway, that's not really important. Cassandra was the priestess of Apollo, and she was gifted, but not really sure it was a gift, with foresight, but no one believes her. So hence they're not really a gift. So she knew about the ending of Troy, the sack of Troy, but no one believed her. And so we follow her from when the Greeks come to Troy down to when she's taken at the end, when Troy's destroyed, she's taken by Agamemnon back to Mycenae, and also follows her then interaction with Clytemnestra and Electra and how they sort of see each other. So it's also a look at what perception each side of a opposing peoples have of each other, and how your belief structure and how your marketing how that affects what people think and believe, and what Cassandra was expecting to happen to her when she was taken to Mycenae. So it's really, I really enjoyed this one. As you can tell also from the tabs, I don't tab as much if I don't like it. Something that I really loved, I think my favourite part, was looking at Clytemnestra and looking at her characterization and looking at how she became who she was. So most of the myths written in I would say the time, but we don't really know when this happened, if it ever did, but during Greek history, most of the myths and stories about her paint her as a very evil person, and she's just a mad woman who does terrible things, and she's just a dreadful person. There's really very little conversation about why she is like that, how she became like that. Was she always just a terrible person, or was she made into the person that we know about from the stories? And I really love the way that Jennifer Saint handled her character. I do have a tab, I think it's this purple one here, where every time she gives Clytemnestra a nice characterization, a kind characterization, something that wasn't just, hey, this is this evil bitch. And I loved that. I thought that was fantastic. I really enjoyed her characterization. It really gave you a new understanding of Clytemnestra and what kind of person she could have been, but also what kind of person she became. It doesn't excuse any of the things she did. It doesn't excuse her being completely taken over by thirst for revenge and the fact that she neglects her other children when things happen and when she is put in this position. She's completely obsessed for 20 years with revenge and with how to get revenge on Agamemnon. She does not just the end thing that she does that we all know about if we know about the myths. It doesn't excuse any of that, and it doesn't say, hey, this is what she went through, so of course she was like that, but it gives you an understanding of that it wasn't just that. She wasn't just a one note person, that she had things going on, that she had things that, you know, that we cause and effect, that things happen and that's why we become the people that we are. And it's not to excuse the people that we become or the decisions that we make, but maybe to explain them. And I loved that. I really, really enjoyed it. Overall, I just thought this was fantastic. I love Jennifer Saint's writing style. I haven't really talked in length with Max and Paige about this one, partly because Max wasn't able to actually read it. Hi. It's been a little while. It's the 10th of October. I have been meaning to sit down and talk to you guys about 2 more books, but I keep forgetting when I'm filming to do so. So it's been a while. It's been a few months, I think, since I finished the books. However, I have now read The Silence of the Girls and The Women of Troy. So these are book 1 and book 2 in a duology by Pat Barker. So these books follow the story of Briseis, who is really not very much in the Iliad, but is another character that Natalie Haynes focused on a little bit as well. But these two are following almost exclusively, although not quite, because we do get Achilles' perspective a couple of times. We do get Patroclus' perspective a couple of times, and I can't remember who else, but we do get a couple of other male perspectives a couple of times, but we mostly follow Briseis. It is from her point of view, so we're in her head, it's first person, and this one follows the events of the Iliad pretty much, and then this one follows after the events of the fall of Troy. So it actually follows post where the Iliad ended. I don't know whether there's any ancient sources or ancient writings that specifically deal with the end of the Trojan War and the actual sack of Troy. We definitely have information from different sources referring to the sack of Troy. The myth of the Trojan horse is something that is very well known and referred to all over the place, by Monty Python even. Like, it's something that everyone knows, the Trojan horse. And in fact, many people, if they think about the Trojan War at all, the Trojan horse is something that gets brought up. We do have the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil in the first century BC, I think, or maybe the 1st century AD, but around that time, which is many centuries after the actual Iliad was written. and the potential events, well, when I say many centuries, a couple of centuries, after when the original, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written by Homer, and when the potential actual war happened. So, the Iliad, I am still reading. I know. I've been reading it for months. I've been listening to it. You guys know I don't really read audiobooks very quickly. Unlike, it feels like, almost every other booktuber around, I pick up audiobooks very infrequently. I don't listen to audiobooks every time I go for a walk, or every time I am doing housework, or every time I'm cooking, or anything like that. So for that reason, I've been taking quite a while to listen to this one. I wanted to listen to it because the original stories would have been oral stories, would have been told in song. So I wanted to, well, it's not saying, but I wanted to kind of get an idea of how it would feel like to listen to the Iliad. But anyway, I have talked about this already, I'm sure, but the Iliad is the final weeks of the Trojan War, and it starts out with Achilles and Agamemnon, who are two Greek kings, fighting over a woman, Briseis, which is who we follow in these two books. I realised while listening to the Iliad that Briseis is not a character that is really referenced very much in the Iliad. I don't know why Briseis is picked out. It seems like Briseis is picked out by a few different people nowadays and referenced as a character who we want to talk about as give a voice to and make a feminist retelling about. She was the catalyst of the argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, but she really didn't have very much of a role in the Iliad. I feel like I know Briseis reasonably well, but I think what I know of Briseis from ancient sources is actually from the Heroides, which was written by Ovid around the same time as the Aeneid was written. So, yeah, I don't really know like why Briseis, because she's mentioned a little bit in the Iliad, and she's definitely mentioned, she's got a whole letter in the Heroides, but I don't know that she's really mentioned much in many other places, so I'm not really sure why. I don't know, and I don't know if my thinking about Briseis in these terms is because I actually have a skewed perspective, because I really love that section, that part of the Heroides. But anyway, so a lot of what Pat Barker has written is, this one is the Iliad from Briseis' perspective, so she would have had to have done a fair bit of research to find Briseis in other stories and other writings about Troy, and I think she would have had to have read and analysed the Heroides by Ovid. For those of you that don't know, the Heroides by Ovid is a series of letters written from heroines of Greek myth and Roman myth, but mostly Greek myth, written to the kind of heroes whose actions had an impact on them, usually for the worst. So we have Briseis, we have Helen, we have Hermione, Helen's daughter, we have Medea, a great deal of female characters from Greek myth who were villainized and often were the villains, or were mad, or what have you. And it's their writing to those heroes, writing this letter and saying, this is why I am who I am, this is why I did what I did, this is what you did, and what the effect of your life, you had on me, and your actions had on me. By modern standards, Ovid is in no way a feminist. Absolutely not. But I feel like it was one of the first feminist retellings of Greek myth, because that was the whole point. Now, there are a few where they are writing back to them. The men are writing back to the women. So, for example, Paris back to Helen. And it's not known whether the rest of letters, so whether it was a dialogue back and forth and the rest of the letters from the heroes just got lost, or whether he only wrote a few, but the fact that we have Medea talking to Jason and saying, this is what happened to me, this is what you actively did to me, this is why I am who I am and why I've made the choice that I made. Ariadne saying the same thing to Theseus and to Dionysus. Briseis talking to Achilles and saying, why are you abandoning me? You did all of this because of me. Why are you abandoning me? And yeah, I feel like it is maybe not the first, but certainly one of the more powerful original feminist retellings of Greek myth. If you like feminist retellings of Greek myth, I would consider picking this up. It was written in the 1st century AD by the poet Ovid. He was a very controversial figure. He actually was banished for some of his poetry. Not these ones, but I'm sure that these had a part to play in that, but specifically what he was saying about Caesar and Augustus. But anyway, recommend. So I feel like what Pat Barker would have had to have done is to read that, as well as do a lot of research into Briseis in general, because I feel like I really enjoyed these books. I really enjoyed these books. I thought they were incredibly well written. I loved Briseis' perspective. I am keen to see Paige's perspective on these. I know Paige had read already The Silence of the Girls and was reading for the first time The Women of Troy. I'm pretty sure she enjoyed them, but I'd be keen to see what her perspective is, because I don't think that Paige had already read the Iliad and has now read it again, but I don't think that she has read the Heroides. I don't think that she has read anything that details Briseis at all. So we're supposed to be having a chat sometime hopefully soon, and we will record that so you'll see us having a chat about it, or my edited version. But yeah, I'd love to hear what Paige has to say about that. But I've loved following Briseis, and I think Pat Barker has written beautiful books. I love her writing style. I love that we are in Briseis' perspective, or in Briseis' head. I do feel like I preferred Electra slightly, because I love Jennifer Saint's writing style. I love her prose, her turn of phrase, and the choices that she made in terms of who she was following and the perspectives that we had. So I really enjoyed Electra. We followed some quite interesting characters in that as well, but I think just slightly beat out these two, but that's purely from a writing style perspective. But what I really liked about these books is that I love the way that we were in Briseis' head. It was very personal. We were following Briseis day to day, living in the camps, her experiences as being a prize, and the way that she absolutely hated being a prize. She hated being a slave. She hated being considered property. But her fear of becoming not so, because if she was not the prize of Achilles, if she was not Achilles' special trophy, then she would become, I don't remember what they called it, or what she called it in the book, but she would just become a kind of camp girl, which is essentially, can be used by anyone. So just living on the street, she wouldn't have had anywhere to live. She was living in Achilles' tent. She was, to all intents and purposes, Achilles' wife, Achilles' war wife, I guess. If she had have done anything to oppose Achilles, to undermine Achilles or anything like that, then she would have been in that position. I loved the way that we get that perspective of what it would have been like for women to be in that space. That real competition between women, that real sense of women competing with each other, that's something that still happens today. We're still taught to compete for position. We're still taught to compete for the male gaze. We're taught to compete with each other, and this is something that was in this book, that she was put in a position where she couldn't be a feminist because she had to survive, and she couldn't help women unless they were specifically right next to her. So she talks about wanting to go and help these slave women who are kind of just everybody's property, and how she can't because it will lower her, and that will put her in a really precarious position. But as the books go on and as we go into this book, she starts to be much more, I guess, what we modern women would call feminist. She starts to stand up more. She starts to try and help other women more. She starts to try to say, well, you know what, life isn't getting any better. I'm stuck in this position. Yes, it could be worse, and my actions will probably make it worse if it's ever discovered, but it also can't get worse because my integrity and my inner self-perception is bad, if that makes sense. And it was just, like I said, it was so personal. We're in her head, and you really felt that workings and those thoughts and the way that being in that position, being a prize of war, would have felt. It was really visceral, and I really, really enjoyed it. Absolutely loved it. So what I was saying a little while ago about this one is, again, much as the entire personality of Briseis was really not in the Iliad. Nothing of this was in the Iliad. The Iliad ends with Hector's death and Achilles dragging his body around, and there's the suggestion that Troy is falling or will fall, but this is where we find Troy falling. A lot of what we know, or a lot of what I knew about the fall of Troy, came from the Aeneid, which again was written by Virgil in, like I said, I'm not sure if it's the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD, but either of the two. A lot of people feel like the Aeneid is Virgil's justification for Rome being, like, Rome is this big political power in the ancient world, but once they are an empire and they've conquered all around the Mediterranean, they've conquered up into Gaul, they've taken over so much of land, and they are now trying to position themselves as being akin to Greece, because Greece was always the cultural centre of the ancient world in the Mediterranean, and they wanted to be as important culturally and politically and, I guess, academically, philosophically, as the Greeks were. And so a lot of modern scholars think that the Aeneid was written to centre Rome as being as important as Greece, because Aeneas was in the Iliad. Aeneas was one of the Trojans who survived the Trojan War, and who ended up going to what is now Rome, or what is now Rome, or what was then Rome. And so it's their way of kind of, well, look, we also have this great history, etc. But that would have been a lot of what I don't. Again, we'll have to have this conversation with Max, which you should see at the end of this video. But I believe that a lot of what is known about the actual sack of Troy and the Trojan horse and the post-Troy sack of Troy and the end of Troy was from the Aeneid. Now, a lot of this would have had to have been entirely invented by Pat Barker, because we go from the sack of Troy and then we go to Achaeans, the Greeks, waiting to be able to set off, and they had to wait for a few months because there was no wind, and it was thought that the gods were taking revenge. Those that liked Troy, those that were on Troy's side, took revenge on the Greeks by keeping them there. So yeah, that's what we are following here. And again, I just loved it. I thought that it was fantastic. I love Briseis's perspective. I really like the character of Briseis. I don't necessarily like her as a person, but I like the way it was written in this book. Yeah, I thought that Pat Barker did a really great job. I have heard a couple of other people say that they didn't think that it was particularly feminist. I don't agree with that. I think that she's given a character who has been very much sidelined throughout history, given them a voice and given a perspective and understanding of war and the effects of war on women, the effects of being a bit of property, being a slave on women, through this one character and through this personal journey of this character. And some of her actions aren't necessarily the actions of a feminist, but everything's relative, and so and even our concept of feminism nowadays in this modern time is very different to what it was even at the beginning of the feminist movement, new wave feminism, but also obviously the suffragist movement and a lot of feminist movements that is known and considered feminists were very white, very upper class, and so the notion of feminism is so broad or so very small depending on where you're coming from. So to say that they're not feminist because she isn't entirely a feminist, which I agree with that. I don't think Briseis is a feminist. But to say the books aren't feminist, I don't think is accurate. But again, it depends on your version of feminism, what you think of when you mean feminism. I think it is, but obviously you might disagree, and that's perfectly acceptable. I'm not saying that you should agree with me, but it's just interesting. It's interesting how different people view things and what they say about things. I'd be interested to hear those people that didn't think Pat Barker's writing was feminist, to know what they thought of some of the other books that I've talked about in this video. Anyway, I'm going to go now. Hello. So it is the 9th of November and I finally finished listening to the Iliad. Actually finished listening to it last month, but I haven't managed to get around to filming anything. However, I am having a chat with Max and Paige this evening, and so I need to get my thoughts about the Iliad into the camera before they're influenced by Max and Paige's thoughts. So, the Iliad. I feel like most people know, at least vaguely, what the Iliad is. So, the Trojan War is something that supposedly, according to myth and legend, happened between the Greeks and the Trojans thousands of years ago, and it was brought about by the Queen of Sparta, Helen, running away with the Prince of Troy, Paris, and then Menelaus, Helen's husband, going and following, putting an army together and asking for his brother Agamemnon's help. Agamemnon was kind of like the head of all the kings, so this was a time when Greece was split up into, it would later be kind of city-states, but split up into kingdoms, and Agamemnon was the king of the Mycenae, and they were the kind of most powerful, they were like proto-Greeks, and they were the most powerful city-state, for want of a better way of putting it, in Greece at the time. And so even though the different kings of the different parts of Greece had their own autonomy, they still kind of answered to Agamemnon. And so he called on them, and they all brought armies to go and to get Helen and bring her back. Depending on what mythology you follow, it was a rescue or it was take her forcefully, what have you. There's a lot of different versions of how this all happened and who the different players were and what different versions and yeah, a bunch of different places where we get our information about this whole saga. But the main extant evidence that we have, written evidence, is from the Iliad, which was written by Homer. I don't actually remember when. I'm sure Max will be able to tell me this evening, but it was written by Homer. It was written probably not even concurrent to when it happened. So the story itself, the myth itself, was potentially probably passed down as oral tradition before it was written into actual papyrus or writing by Homer. So he's the first person, or they are the first person to have written it, but that doesn't mean that he was writing or they were writing concurrent. It doesn't mean that anyone actually knows really when this apparently happened. So it's kind of before, like, certainly before writing that we can decipher. There's a possibility, of course, that it was potentially even before, although if he's the king of Mycenae, potentially it was written, I think it was supposedly written in more kind of ancient Greek, which means it was written before, like, quite a bit after the event supposedly happened. So we don't have anything, as far as I know, we don't have anything concurrent with when it was happening, supposedly happening. where we get the main information, the main story from, is from the Iliad. Now, the Iliad is not the entire Trojan War. For the beginning of the Trojan War, you have to go to other sources, other myths and legends, but the Iliad tells of the last, 6 weeks, I think, of the Trojan War, and it actually starts with an argument between Agamemnon and Achilles. Achilles is a kind of lesser king to Agamemnon, but he is the son of a minor goddess, Thetis, and he is half divine. So he's a lesser king, but he's also really powerful and considered really highly and well known and renowned and etc. So the Iliad is actually the last sort of 6 weeks of leading up to the Trojan War. It's not even the actual end of the Trojan War. We're coming to the Iliad as the Greeks have just sacked a minor Trojan town, and they've taken prisoners and taken a bunch of different spoils from the town, and as prizes, various different kings and generals and what have you are given some of these things that they've taken, and that includes slaves, includes humans, includes women. Agamemnon has been given, I can't remember her name, but one of the women that was given to Agamemnon is the daughter of a priest of Apollo, and the priest comes into, he's a Trojan priest, and he comes into the camp and he begs for his daughter back, and Agamemnon flatly refuses him, calls him a bunch of names, tells him to go away. So he does, but as recompense for that, he calls on Apollo to exact his revenge, and Apollo does so by causing a plague across all of the Greek camp. And the plague ravages them for quite a while, quite a few days, and lots of people die. The kings gather a couple of times to try and convince Agamemnon to give up the daughter, and he refuses a few times, and it just gets to the point where they're basically going to lose the war because of plague. And so he agrees finally, but only if Achilles will give him his prize, which is Briseis. And Achilles has a big strop about that. So Achilles and Agamemnon are at each other's throats about one not wanting to give up their prize and the other one not wanting to give up their prize. And finally it's agreed that everyone argues that just do it, Achilles, because, we need this plague to end. So that's what happens. So Achilles gives Briseis over to Agamemnon. Agamemnon gives, I can't remember her name, but Agamemnon gives this woman back to her father. The plague stops. Everything's fine. But then Achilles is so angry, he refuses to fight, and he refuses to send in his myrmidons, and Achilles is renowned as an excellent fighter, and he's the best of the Greeks in terms of warcraft, and his myrmidons are the best of the Greeks. And so this is a serious setback to the Greek situation and to their ability to fight the Trojans. And then there are various battles. We do also follow some of the different characters in Troy. We have a few moments where we follow Hecabe and Priam, who are the king and queen of Troy. We follow Andromache, which is Hector's wife. Hector is the first prince of Troy. We follow Hector, we follow Paris, we follow a bunch of different Trojans as well as the Greeks. Eventually, the Greeks are getting so just trashed that Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, goes to Achilles and says, look, I know you're angry and I understand that, and you have a right to be. However, we're getting trashed, we need to sort this out. We are needed. And Achilles is still refusing, but he says, well, you can take them, you can have the myrmidons. I refuse, but I will let go enough for that. So he gives Patroclus his armor and he sends them into battle, and then Patroclus is killed by Hector, and then that makes Achilles just see absolutely red, and then he goes in and kills Hector and is horrible, just awful to Hector, and defiles his body and does all this stuff. And then we essentially end the book when Priam comes into the Greek camp to try and beg for his son's body back. That's basically the story. I listened to the Iliad. I wanted to do that because I feel like it would originally have been, like I said, oral tradition. So even if it was written in pentamic iambic. which is like epic poetry, so it would have been spoken aloud even from the even straight off of the book. Like, it would have been still an oral story. So I wanted to listen to it. I feel like that may have been an error because it took me ages to listen to it. I'm not a huge audiobook listener. I'm glad that it may have been a mistake in that sense, but I'm glad that I did. I feel like it gave me a real sense of how it would have been spoken and delivered. I felt like it was quite Shakespearean, which obviously made me think that Shakespeare got a lot of his inspiration from the epics, from the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, which was interesting. It may have been the choice of the narrator more than necessarily how it would have been back in the day, but I still think that was really interesting, so I'm glad I listened to it. A few things that I noted. I remember some things from the Iliad quite well before I went in and listened to it again. I'm glad that I reread it because it's good to listen to it, because it's good to get an idea of what was important in the original OG, but at the same time it could have been cut down so much. There's an awful lot of his shining helmet and his shining eyes and his gleaming sword and his fast chariot. Like, there's a lot of descriptions of their equipment and their horses and all the things that they have that makes them great, apparently. And there's a lot of them like stopping and having good old chats on the battlefield. A lot of things that happen are like Trojans and Greeks kind of meeting each other in battle and then realizing that they're connected somehow, and kind of like having a bit of we can't fight then, or like, it's so good to meet you, but now that I know that you like met my best friend one time and now let me kill you, is really strange. But I think obviously that says a lot about the concept of guest friendship, which is what really the whole Iliad is about, because the concept of guest friendship is the idea that if you have that connection with someone, you can't then take anything from them, you can't then do anything to them, you can't take battle to them. So guest friendship is like when you welcome someone into your home, then that's almost like a family tie. Paris was welcomed into Sparta, into the home of Helen and Menelaus and Sparta, and whatever actually happened between him and Helen, many, again, stories about that, but it is certainly seen that he kidnapped Helen, he took Helen, he went against guest friendship. So that's really interesting, and that was brought through a lot. And there were some really interesting conversations, there were some really interesting bits of the Iliad, but I do definitely think it would have been cut down a lot if it was written now, because a lot of it is that overly descriptive about their helmets and their armour and like all the things that they have that make them important or show importance. And we definitely wouldn't want that in a modern book. And you'd notice, if you read any of the retellings that we've read, they don't come up in the modern book. You may wonder also, just on a completely different tangent, why we haven't read the Song of Achilles. I didn't suggest it because a really large portion of that is not to do with the Trojan War, so I didn't think it was necessarily relevant, but certainly features Patroclus and Achilles, so it's definitely part of the story, but it's not the main thing of what we were doing. But anyway, I don't really have much else to say about the Iliad. I am definitely interested to have our chat this evening and see what Max and Paige think. Anyway, I'm going to go get lunch, and I'll talk to you later.
Hi everybody. So as you can see, all three of us are live on screen, which is very exciting. So I'm sure you all know Paige from Pages with Paige. And if you don't know Paige from Pages with Paige, then you need to go and subscribe to her channel immediately, which is linked down below. And then we have Max, who is one of my best friends in the entire universe, and also a professional classicist who we have, I'm sure, both mentioned multiple times when we've been talking about the books and stuff. We thought it would be fun to have a bit of a actual live chat, live to tape, is that what they say? Chat with Max, with the three of us, and particularly getting Max's perspective. So I sent a bunch of things to think about to Max earlier today, so we'll probably talk about those things, but in general we'll just kind of talk about, I guess, what we feel we gained from this experience, how we just general thoughts about reading all the books and whether we enjoyed it and all those sorts of things. So I guess maybe we go around the circle, triangle, and we can all say kind of what our general feelings are now that we've finished our project. Yeah. I can start if we want.
Sure.
I am feeling a little bit tired. I had a bit of a busy weekend, so excuse me if I also am not braining very well. But I really enjoyed with this reading vlog experience. I didn't love all of the books that we read, but I enjoyed reading them anyway, and I definitely enjoyed having the chats that we were having because it put like a different perspective on things as I was reading them and clarified a few things as I was reading them and helped me kind of think through a bit more of the purpose of the books, because I feel like a lot of all of the books that we read were written with a purpose in mind, and I think that most of them were to somewhat try and put a bit of a feminist lens on the Trojan War and on the Iliad in particular. So it helped, I think, to have those chats as we were going through and reading them. I mean, obviously, like, people read things for all sorts of reasons, and the pure proliferation of books about the Trojan War, retellings of the Trojan War and of the Iliad kind of shows that, like, they're obviously really popular at the moment. And I'm sure a lot of people are reading them just because they're popular and, just for entertainment, which is absolutely obviously fine. But I found it really interesting to think of it from the perspective of, what is the purpose of this? Why are people doing this at the moment? What are they trying to achieve? And something that we didn't discuss, and also, sorry, Max, I didn't actually send this as a question for you.
It's okay.
But why through fiction? Why not through, I mean, I'm sure there's been many, obviously there's been many like scholarly books and academic research papers and journal articles and all sorts of things discussing these very topics, but why fiction for general consumption as opposed to professional classicists such as yourself? So anyway, that's just what I was thinking about as I was reading the books.
Let's come back to that point about like what professional classicists have been doing and what the fiction writers have been doing and how they might link up and influence each other. Because I don't think it's either or, I think it's both. And sometimes it's people who are trained who are then also writing novels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Natalie Haynes has written some non-fiction, obviously, as well as fiction. And I assume that she's had some training.
Yeah, definitely. And Madeleine Miller is another one. Maybe shall I do my year? I definitely feel like I did not do the project kind of as intensively as you guys did, and it hasn't been a kind of year thing for me. So it's been really, really cool to be part of and to witness you guys doing it. And it's been cool to read a few of the extra books or reread things that I hadn't dipped into. But I've been like teaching around these topics and researching a little bit around them, around women's writing and rewriting of contemporary myth, probably now for about 8 or 9 years. And I had a student who did a project very much on like feminist retellings of the Trojan War, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, an honours project. And I already have plans for how I'm going to tackle this next in the next course I do on my gender and sexuality and antiquity course. So I feel kind of almost envious of you guys that you've done it really intensively and thoroughly, because there's a few books that you guys mentioned that I'm like, no, I did not get around to reading that one. But it's been really cool to hear you guys or see you guys through the chat that we've had, like bouncing ideas off each other and asking me questions, because it's definitely got me to think about things, just more from the perspective of a general fiction reader and less from the perspective of if I had to teach this, how would I teach it? Which has been really cool.
I suppose it's helped you to think about how to teach it as well. Like, what are people, especially first years, I suppose, who may have not academically studied before, like how would they be thinking about it as they're reading it?
Yeah, definitely.
So have you added any of these? Sorry, Paige.
You could.
Have you added any of these books to your syllabus or anything like that? Or?
Well, actually, sadly, I've had to cut one out, if anything. But that's not because I don't think it's great material. It's just because of other factors. What I am hoping to do is in a couple of years, I will probably be allowed to or be able to teach our EPIC course, which I haven't done before. So I've incorporated EPIC into other things, and I've incorporated gender and sexuality material into other courses, but this will be the first time that I'll actually have like the EPIC course. And I think what I'm going to do is kind of have pairings, you know, like when you go to a fancy restaurant, not that I go to fancy restaurants, but you know how they have like the wine or the beer that they recommend you have with each course. So I kind of want to do that where I have like, here's a chunk of the Iliad and here's a modern feminist version like the next week. And sort of do like paired kind of tastings of the Iliad. So that's my idea. Well, and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. So that's my idea at the moment.
That's so cool.
It definitely sounds more palatable.
Yes. Well, especially if I can get Madeline Miller in there. I think her Circe, I mean, I love Song of Achilles, but I think her Circe book, well, I know a lot of my students, like hundreds of my students say to me that that's been a big influence on them. So if I can get that in there, I think it's really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
How about you, Paige?
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with this. I did find that I learned something very valuable about myself, and that is I cannot read the same topic of something multiple months in a row. Because looking back over my vlog footage for Electra, it was only the second month, but I was already in the state of, I've already read this. Like, even though it's different and the way that they're presenting it's completely different. It was like, I've heard this story already. And then trying to face the Iliad, which I've already struggled with to read previously because I don't come at it from an academic perspective. I am looking purely at my reading from an enjoyment perspective. Yeah. It's hard. And so it was like, okay, so it took a lot of effort for me to get into the groove with it, but I've found it really valuable in actually learning to articulate my thoughts better and picking up like key things that normally I just brush over. Like for me, I think one thing that we have discussed a lot, but it's still sort of floating around in my brain is what is actually constituted as a feminist retelling, and is it actually the goal of the author, or is it pitched by publishers because they know that it sells? Because for me, it was especially really present in 1,000 Ships. It wasn't claiming to be a feminist retelling on the cover. There is nowhere that it said it. It was, we are retelling this from the perspective of the women. But it didn't say it was doing it from a feminist perspective. So it's like, and then I had that sitting throughout all the different things, and not really having many brain cells to work with the Iliad was very difficult to then pull out like the feminist side of things and sort of look at it in that perspective. But because we had that chat and I was vlogging my thoughts and trying to spit it out as best as humanly possible, it actually helped in being able to just understand it better. Not well, but better. And then Pat Barker, I loved their writing. And so for me, it was very easy to just fall into their writing again. And I'm also a speed reader. I don't take time to sit with books. Like for most of these, I was reading them within 2 days. And when you're doing something like this, that was not a great choice on my part, because I should take my time to sit with it and be able to enjoy it. And the one that I did, which was 1,000 Ships, that took me 5 days, where the rest of it was either a day or 2 days. I remember it that much better. And it felt the most impactful, even though it was mid-tier. So it was just interesting. And I'm glad that we've done it, because it really got me to sort of branch out and try something new and do something different. But I think the way that I am as a reader, if we continue on and do a different reiteration of this, I need to just set aside a week and just sit with it nice and slow. Because that way it's going to be a better overall result in terms of my enjoyment, my understanding, and the overall content, because I will actually be able to think through things better.
That makes so much sense. And I think it's really cool that this has ended up being a learning experience about how you learn, Sorry,
Yeah.
teacher nerd.
No,
It's like
that's
one of
good.
my pet passions. What you said about the like struggling a little bit with the Iliad reminded me of part of our chat a while ago where we were talking about like, well, what different translations would I recommend or what different versions? And you guys were talking about audiobooks and stuff. And that was really interesting and useful for me because it just kind of reminded me, like I teach Iliad to first year students in a myth course. And I try and break it down and make it accessible. But it was just a really, really good reminder that there's the story, which has all these awesome elements, which are so appealing to so many different people. And then there's the way that the story is conveyed by Homer, or composed by Homer, which has all of these artifacts of ancient Greek poetic composition, like catalogues and these really crazy similes. And it has all these inconsistencies because it was passed down in the oral tradition. So there are things where you're like, what? Does this make sense? And all of that sort of stuff I'm quite used to. And I sort of forget that actually, so I think of that as being part of how and why the Iliad is such a great story. But actually, for a lot of people, I think they can be really attracted to the story, but the actual way that it's told by Homer, they don't connect with. And that was, fair enough. It's poetry that comes from a completely different time and place. And it's not necessarily what a lot of us want to read for enjoyment anymore.
Well, I feel like I need to apologize to Paige for making you read the Iliad. Because you were kind of like, I've read it before, and I was like, no, I think you need to reread it. And so of course I also reread it, and it took me ages because I did it by audio. It was good. I'm glad I'd listened to it audibly. But yeah, think that I had probably not obviously the same way you have, Max, because I don't teach it, but I had done a similar thing because when I read it as part of a course that we then like studied it and analyzed it. And so I remember the story of the Iliad and I remember what the content was, but not Homer's way of, sorry, it's cat feeding time. So Buffalo is giving her high five to get the dinner.
High five. Num 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 num.
But yeah, so I had
Can I just say, Mel, I don't think anyone should ever apologize for making anyone else read the Iliad. Like, just putting it out there.
But
And
I
did
kind
get
of
to
had
listen to
forgotten,
Dan
like,
Stevens.
sorry.
I listened to the Dan Stevens narration, and that was the only thing that got me through.
Yeah.
That man
It's
just
really
stuck to my
cool.
ovaries.
It's really cool that you guys did the audio versions because I had read the Iliad and taught it a lot of times before I saw any kind of performed version. So there's a one man play called An Iliad, which was written by a couple of creators in the US. I think about 2 decades now ago as like an anti-war play, and it's been performed in Auckland in New Zealand where I live and kind of taken over by the director Michael Hurst and this like great New Zealand version of it. And that has whole slabs of the Iliad that he brings to life. And it really makes such a difference. And I know the audiobook experience would be a bit different again, but it's so much closer to what people actually would have experienced in the original, context.
Well, that's why I wanted to listen to it audibly because I realized that when I read it, I read it with the aid of Marguerite and Terry. That was our old classics lecturers at Newcastle Uni. And so because I studied it, I think I remember some of the good bits, the like bits of story. And I'd forgotten just how much shining helmet there was.
Oh my God, the arming scenes, right? Like, and then he put on his leg greaves and he fastened the leg greaves around his enormous calves, and then he put on the other leg greaves, and then he put on his armor, and then amazing. And then you read that like 10 times in a row. And also how violent it is as well. Like that was something that came across to me when I saw that out loud, like the performed version, because he's actually kind of acting the stuff out, but in like a one-man way. Mm-hmm. And you just go, oh my God, this is so gory and so disgusting, like eyeballs coming out on the ends of spears, and like the spear goes in and then the twist and the entrails come out, and just like there's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines where it's just that, and you're like, oh, I don't really remember this from class.
No, and I feel like a lot of people think of, I guess because of the way, it's nice.
Hi, Rowan.
I don't think he realized that I was talking to you. I said I was doing a YouTube thing, and I think he just assumed that did not involve Max.
Yeah, what with me being like allergic to YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. And now I've totally lost my train of thought. Sorry.
We were talking about the oral aspect and the
Yeah.
blood and the gore, and you were saying you think people maybe forget or don't realize how much of it is.
Yeah, well, because of the way it's written, it feels very kind of classical, I guess. What is classics? And so it feels like something that you should think of as being kind of highbrow, kind of like Shakespeare, in the sense that people see Shakespeare these days as like, that's what you do when you do like A levels English or whatever. And so they forget about that part of it, that it is gory, or that it has lots of like penis jokes, or whatever, depending on which.
So Homer doesn't really have the penis jokes.
No, well, that's why I was also going to say, depending whether you're talking Shakespeare or Homer, but yeah.
Yeah.
I
I just feel like we don't want your
Gore or
subscribers to be like,
penises?
oh my god, penis jokes. I'm going to go read the Iliad now.
Yeah, I'm going to go
It'll be
read the
amazing.
Iliad because of all the smut.
Oh,
You can read other things, other Greek mythology retellings for the smut.
Katie Rabbit.
As per example, the fact that it was an oral story told orally until Homer wrote it.
Homer didn't write it.
Sorry, yes, recorded it. Wrote it down.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Please enlighten.
So Homer didn't write anything down. The versions that we have of the Iliad and the Odyssey that are written down come from about 400 or 500 years after we think Homer was composing, if Homer was a single person rather than a group of people composing at different times. Yeah, the general consensus at the moment is that it's about a 400 to 500 year lag between any period of composition. And the fact that it was orally composed explains some of the really kind of weird things about it. So you know how there's heaps of sections where the text just kind of repeats on itself?
Yeah.
So you'll have like one, like Zeus says, oh, go down and deliver this speech. And then he gives the whole speech. And then the messenger goes down and then gives the entire speech. And then someone gives it to somebody else. So that's a real hallmark of oral composition, because it is like a memory aid. And all the repeated lines and half lines, like thus spoke Achilles of the swift-footed, heel, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, so there are all these kind of hallmarks of oral composition that you don't find in later Greek and Roman epics when they are just actually writing them. But then there's this question of, is Homer one person who's creating this particular story? Is it a whole group of people at different times creating different bits of it? But the fact that it wasn't compiled until hundreds of years later probably explains some of the inconsistencies, like the war's been going on for 10 years, but there's this bit in book 3 where King Priam's like, Helen, tell me who all these men are down here on the plains, as though the war's just started. So there's a few things like that kind of seem like plot holes or story inconsistencies, and that's entirely possibly because of that, because it would never have been performed all at once. It would have been like, a couple of hours here, a couple of hours there, but people we don't think are in general performing the entirety of the Iliad or the Odyssey. So it doesn't need to be consistent in the way that we think of, like, a book has to be consistent. Every version of the book has to be the same because they have to match. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So does that mean that it's also possible that like some of what it was written actually was like from audience participation? Like, did they have that?
We don't know much. We don't have evidence of audience participation, as in, the bard saying something, say in 560, and people speaking back to the bard.
Yeah.
But we do have evidence from, say, the 500s down into the 400s of many bards going around the Greek world and performing Homer at competitions, so performing the Iliad or the Odyssey or bits of those things at competitions and winning prizes for it, and these poems being kind of spread far and wide, but somewhat different versions. There are some sources from, I think, the 400s BC where people quote Homer, but we don't have those bits of Homer. I actually really love the idea of audience participation. I don't think there's any explicit evidence for that, but part of my theory about some of these texts that are transmitted orally is that probably the bards, as they're going to different places, might present the story in a particular way or name check certain things in a way that corresponds to the audience. So if you're giving the catalogue of ships of all the different people who came to Troy, and if you're doing it in a place where a bunch of people were sent as fighters, maybe you beef that bit up a little bit, or maybe you name check a few particular heroes. I think probably that stuff happened.
Yeah. So like if you were in Sparta, you'd make a bigger deal about like Menelaus and the Spartans and whatnot, then you'd kind of maybe play down the
potentially
Athenians.
yeah.
So how does that? Because there's a fair bit of agreement that we're talking about the Mycenae
Mhm.
kind of era. So how does that? If we're talking about that, but then it wasn't kind of recorded physically on a bit of paper,
Mhm.
whatever, papyrus, until 500 years or so later, when we no longer have like, how does that kind of influence? Does that? I don't know if
That's
that question made any sense.
yeah,
Sorry.
it did.
You,
No, it's it
nodding and knowing that Max knows exactly what I'm trying to ask, and just forget that, like, potentially I'm talking to whoever's watching this vlog, and Paige also. Sorry about that. Matt maybe will help me out by just explaining what the hell I'm trying to talk about.
I think that what Mel's talking about let me read your mind, Mel, after our many years of friendship.
Yes.
I suspect what you're referring to is the fact that there's about a 500-year gap between the archaeological evidence of the great palace civilizations at Mycenae and Tiryns in Argos, which is on the Peloponnese of Greece, mainland Greece. And that's around the same time that we get there are layers of the ancient city of Troy that show that there's some kind of war or destruction. So we think that it's plausible that sometime, say in like 1250 BC or 1200 or sometime around then, you've got on the Greek mainland, you've got these massive palaces that seem to be controlling a lot of the surrounding area, and you seem to have nobility ruling them. And across the Aegean Sea, you seem to have this big citadel of Troy being burned down in destruction. Then about 500 years later, you've got these oral tales circulating of a great war between that Mycenaean power in Greece and the citadel of Troy, which controlled a whole bunch of the surrounding area. And sorry, Troy is in modern day Turkey, if that helps, quite close to Gallipoli, if there's any Australian or New Zealand viewers, which I'm sure there are. So is that sort of what you're talking about, Mel? You're talking about the fact that we've got this archaeological record that suggests that maybe there's some kind of connection between those two civilizations.
Yeah. And also I
And
was
then you've
wondering,
got
like,
these oral
if they're
tales.
being performed in, like, the Athens of, I was about to say Cicero, no, wrong. The Athens of, like, the playwright, like,
Like Pericles and
Pericles,
Plato
yeah.
and
Like,
Aeschylus and all
the
this.
actual how the records of what Athens was like and what the structure of Greece was like was very different 500
Oh,
years
totally.
to what the Mycenae empire was like. So I'm just wondering, I guess, how do you think that did it influence the way it was written, or like what effect would that have had?
Are you asking me whether I think that there was really a Trojan War?
No,
Okay.
yes, that wasn't what I was asking, but yes, do you think there was a Trojan War? But I'm asking about, like, I guess the effect on the audience of, like, I guess it's similar to us watching Shakespeare, of it being something so outside of their existence, and their understanding, and, like,
I think,
this is not our
yeah,
country isn't structured like this anymore. So, like, we aren't Mycenaeans we aren't Mycenaean
Mycenaeans.
people anymore.
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
Do you know what? I actually think I know exactly what you mean about the time lag, and I think Shakespeare's a really good comparison. 500-600 years, same language, but also very, very different. There's
Mm.
whole words and dialects that have gone out of fashion. There's new words and ways of speaking that have come in that 500 years. But so yes, there are some differences. But actually, the ancient Greece in the Mycenaean era seems to have worked that there were lots of people who spoke similar enough languages, some version of Greek, that they could communicate and they could trade. There's lots of trading going on. But you've basically got these small palace kind of civilizations which are relatively localized. And so the story of the Trojan War is not a pan-Greek story of all Greeks think and feel the same and they all go off and fight Troy. It's a story of a kind of collective of, like, a union, almost like something like the United States of America or something like that, where actually there's really diverse local cultures, there's diverse ways of speaking and thinking. And even though there's some shared religious framework, there are different, like, the gods operate a little bit differently in different places. That level of variety in ancient Greece still exists in the age of Athens. Like, Athens in the 5th century with its radical democracy is really different from the way Corinth is operating, I don't know, 100 miles down the road. Actually, I don't know if it's 100 miles, which is really different from the way Sparta's operating a little bit further down south, which is different from what you find on an island. So actually, I think that the diversity of the different kinds of warriors who go to fight the Trojans actually kind of works to keep the myth alive, because Greeks don't develop like a pan-Greek identity really for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If that helps, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I wasn't really asking you to say anything that we actually have evidence for, because I was like, what do you think the audience would have thought about this thing that,
Yeah. There's definitely the way that warfare works in the ancient Greek, like in the Iliad and the Odyssey, is really different from what people say in Athens or Sparta or anything would have been familiar with, like reasonably different. Some of the technologies have changed, so some of the technologies that we find in the Iliad people wouldn't have been using so much, like they're not a Bronze Age civilization anymore. And so an analogy that jumps to my mind is if you think about periods in England where, for example, the King James Bible was taught so widespread that people that it permeated the language and that people could kind of think in terms of King James's sayings. If you think about the technologies that people have in the Bible and the way that people live their life, it's really different. But because the Bible was so widespread, people in like Renaissance England thought it, like they could make sense of it. Does that make sense? So the Iliad and the Odyssey are so widespread that even though in a way they're really, really alien, they still make sense to the Greeks, because like if you're brought up with those stories from such a young age, it does make sense to you, even though like actually if you stop and think about it, like it doesn't.
Yeah. Again, I guess the Shakespeare comparison, like we all grow up learning or hearing lines from Shakespeare, or like without even realizing it, like how many lines are we like, oh, that's a Shakespeare, of course it is, kind of,
like
sorry,
Bubble.
I'm just gonna let the cat out of the room. Yes, Pistachio, I know.
Goodbye, Pistachio.
Fare thee well.
Fare thee well.
I was just thinking, Mel, what you were saying with Shakespeare. I don't know if people are still teaching like this, but oh my God, over 20 years ago when I was learning Shakespeare in English classes, it was very much like the tragedies are plays about particular times and places, but they're actually about universal emotions and universal mistakes. So here, learn this tragedy about a king from the 1100s and see how it relates to your life. Welcome to Macbeth. And I feel like there's a lot of similarity, like we have evidence that people in the ancient Greek world thought about their moral dilemmas in terms of like, and then Odysseus dishonors Ajax, and then a goddess, sends like a cloud of madness to make Ajax mad, and then he kills himself. How does this relate to your life? Like they kind of do actually think in those terms.
Same kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but yeah, that's interesting.
Paige, I'm sorry, Mel and I have just been ranting.
I was about to say
no, it's okay, because it's good. I'm like, okay, this actually like helps. But I have no further thoughts to add. I just it's helping brain to be like, oh, because I'm also geographically challenged. So when you're saying places, I'm like, they are a thing on a piece of earth.
I was gonna say, I don't know if you do this because I don't YouTube, but you could like have a picture of like the palace at Mycenae.
I could totally do that.
Yeah.
I could be like, haha, I have been
Yeah.
See, the thing what our viewers don't know is in the back of my head, and potentially even Max's head, when I was talking about Mycenae, was the image of us in Mycenae.
Yeah, totally.
Love that.
You know how you were talking about the fiction versus scholarship thing, Mel? So there has been heaps of attention in the last, let's say, 40 years, heaps of attention by feminist classicist scholars onto these texts from the perspective of, well, what were women doing? Can they tell us anything about what women were doing? Do we know how women in the audience responded? Are these completely male constructions?
Women in the audience?
Were there even women? Were there even women? When were women? All those sorts of things. And so there's so much great scholarship. And just for one example, there's a woman called Ruby Blondell who's written heaps and heaps on Helen of Troy and how Helen was used by lots of different ancient Greek authors at different times as archetypes of different things. Like there's heaps of great scholarship. But when you're asking kind of why fiction and why do like novelists keep referring to this stuff, I think maybe, for example, why do they return to this stuff more than historical exemplar? They could be doing historical fiction about Aspasia or Artemisia or any of those, any of those kind of big name ancient Greek women, and they tend not to. I don't think that's being done, and I think that people come back to the myths again and again because there is that flexibility inherent in the genre of a myth. And I don't want to say that myths are fiction, because obviously for a lot of people the myths that their culture are based on they don't think of them as fictional, and they're not necessarily fictional, but they're not historically falsifiable. And I think that makes them really valuable for storytellers.
That makes sense.
Because you can very quickly disprove, if someone wants to write a historical novel about what Aspasia was doing in 442 BC, you can very quickly disprove that. So then it's like, well, I guess you're doing alternative fiction, like alternative history or something.
And they're always, well, maybe not always, but they're often, at least here in Tasmania, they're often shelved with the fantasy. So I guess, like, to a certain extent, they can be seen as a fantasy retelling, even though none of the ones we've actually done were fantasy retellings. But,
I suppose when you have that mythological element to it, though, for Western culture, if you say the word myth, it's fantasy.
And I mean, there were gods in the Iliad, like the gods were constantly running around doing things. So, like, absolutely, you would, depending on your perspective, like you said, if you come from the perspective of it being myth, being fiction, then, like, a god is obviously a fantastical creature. If you have the god of war appearing in Crescent City, for example, then, like, you would never call that like an appearance of a fictional of a person, a historical person, just despite the fact that to many people like Zeus was a real person or real god.
I think you're right about the like false equivalence of myth equals fiction, but also myth equals fantasy. But I think also there's like underpinning that is just a real kind of theological chauvinism based on our, like, where we are in the kind of Judeo-Christian world, the remnants of that world, that, like, I'm just thinking about, I think it's in The Silence of the Girls, the Pat Barker one, where Thetis is really clearly a character and is a goddess. And is an ocean goddess, and so when Achilles is out swimming, he's like communing with her. From a Greek perspective, that's not fantastical. It's not supernatural. It's not even, mythos wouldn't be a useful term. A mythos, which is where we get our word myth in ancient Greek, just means like a speech act, like something that you say or that you speak. They just wouldn't, like they just, but if you,
like he's talking to his mum, he just happens to be doing it. She just happens to be a goddess, so he needs to, like, I go to Kingston to see mum and dad, like,
exactly.
He goes to see mum.
And in like in Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, when Thetis has even more of a presence, and the centaur is in that one, right? And they are like hanging out with the centaur again. That wouldn't be seen as supernatural, and it wouldn't be seen as fantastical. That's just part of the like cosmological and theological framework. But if as a publisher you're coming at things with a kind of assumed perspective that any of those gods are not real, then you're not thinking of it as theological, you're thinking of it as something
story,
pure.
as fantastical.
Exactly.
And I guess because like C.S. Lewis put lots of centaurs. Centaurs are in Harry Potter. Like, there's lots of fantasy with so many that have borrowed so many Greek like mythological figures, mythological creatures, that it would have to, like, I guess, Greek mythology retelling. Where else does it go? Because like all the fantasy that has Western fantasy will have at least one Greek mythological creature in it. So,
I'm just pulling up Goodreads because I was looking through my spreadsheet and I realized that I had tagged 1,000 Ships as historical, Electra is fantasy, the Iliad is classic, and then Silence of the Girls as fantasy, but the Women of Troy as historical. And I don't know how I missed that earlier, that I didn't have continuity. And so now I'm just quickly pulling up Goodreads in each of the books. So 1,000 Ships is genre is mythology and historical fiction. Electra is mythology fantasy. The Women of Troy is mythology historical fiction. And The Silence of the Girls is historical fiction. So I just fucked up with that one. But Electra is considered more fantasy, whereas the other three are historical.
That's interesting.
I wonder, why is the Electra considered more fantasy?
Yeah.
Maybe because it does have more of a focus on Cassandra and their relationship with Apollo. So for that, it's like, obviously not fantastical, but in Western publishing lens, fantastical elements to it. Well, it's just her story. Whereas the others don't. She's woven in, but there's nothing really that stands out to me as fantastical relationship or dynamic in that capacity, to the same that Electra really did focus on her. So maybe, but
it's interesting.
it could just because they just viewed it under the fantasy lens. Same with Ariadne, I think.
The Ariadne one makes more sense to me being fantasy because, like, you know, you've got the Minotaur and the threads, like magic is involved. And magic was always involved. Well, actually, is that true? No, I was going to say magic was always involved. Actually, that's not necessarily true. Anyway.
Yeah, the other one's shelved as fantasy. So it was shortlisted for Waterstone's Book of the Year and finalist for Goodreads Choice Fantasy category.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure I saw Ariadne was in a fantasy Goodreads Choice, and I was a bit like, really?
So I suppose
I can understand that because I think it's played up the supposedly magical element, right? I think Cersei did that. Madeline Miller's Cersei did that.
Yeah. Yeah, Madeline Miller very much played into the Cersei being a witch.
So then it sort of became, but then fantasy first for Cersei rather than mythology.
I mean, that comes back to what we were saying before about marketing versus like the intention of the author versus the marketing. I feel like Madeline Miller, if she is a classicist, if that's, you know, she's also researching on an academic level, then maybe if she were doing that marketing, maybe she would not put fantasy first, but
because same for Song of Achilles, its highest is fantasy, historical, and then romance. But this is just off Goodreads, like this.
This is Goodreads, so that's not the that's not really the be all and end all of publishing anyway. But it's a good litmus of where people who read it are viewing things as well. Which
I just need to grab some. Sorry, I just need to grab some more water. I'll be back in a second.
I suppose while they're just grabbing that, what was your overall rating for everything?
That is an excellent question. I don't think I've given an overall rating for I've given individual ratings for the books, obviously, but I don't think I've given a rating for the project in general.
I just I've got their individual ratings.
So Jennifer Saint's book, I'm sure you would not be surprised at all, is probably my highest one rating. I'm trying to find them. So I rated 1,000 Ships a 3. I gave Jennifer Saint, I gave Electra 5 stars. I gave The Silence of the Girls 5 stars as well. And I gave Women of Troy 4. I think on Core Pile, though, the Electra would come out slightly ahead.
Makes sense.
And then I don't remember what I gave the Iliad. Because I could go into Core Pile. That would probably help.
I'm sorry. You're talking about giving the Iliad a star rating?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Okay. What kind of world is this?
I gave it a 3. But I think that was mostly from the perspective. I think that was mostly from the perspective of like the story rather than the telling.
I think you just broke Max.
Sorry, Max. I didn't mean to break you.
You didn't break me. No one breaks me by their poor judgment of the Iliad. I deal with students.
Should I have given it a higher rating?
Well, you know, like I kind of feel like it's unrateable.
Fair enough.
Like, I don't know, how can you rate? Okay, you know that in general I don't do the whole like classics is the foundation of Western civilization, blah 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 blah. Like I really in general don't believe in that. But if you're gonna pick one, if you're gonna pick one thing and be like, if you took this Jenga block out of like literature, what would happen?
Yeah.
If you take the Iliad out, or the Odyssey, if you take out the different ones, then different things happen. But like some pretty significant other works then completely failed to materialize.
This entire conversation wouldn't be happening for
I don't actually think you would be born.
fair.
That was a joke.
I find it interesting, like, because for me, one of my main focuses has been the whole publishing trend of this. So, yeah, literally this project wouldn't exist. But what would we be reading instead?
Well, I don't know, but you know what you wouldn't have is the Metamorphoses. Okay, think
That's
think
fine. I haven't read that. I'm too scared.
No, but that's okay, because if you've read any Greek mythology or anything that's infected by or infused by Greek mythology, you're actually basically reading versions of Ovid's Metamorphoses, because the canonical versions of Greek mythology that we have are almost all Ovid's versions. The Trojan War stuff is actually maybe the major exception to that. But heaps of the stories, a huge amount of the stories that have become kind of canonical as the Greek myths we have from Ovid's Met, and you wouldn't have the Met without. Basically, if you take out the Iliad and the Odyssey, you lose the Greek epic tradition, which means that you then lose the Roman epic tradition. The Roman epic tradition began with translations of the Odyssey and then of the Iliad, and then of kind of versions of the same sorts of things. And then the great Roman national identity project of can we do a poem that captures who we are and what we are is a mashup. I'm being so unkind to Virgil here. I love you, Virgil. I just taught Virgil like so much this year. But you couldn't, Virgil's great, the Aeneid's great, but you literally can't have the Aeneid without the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Yeah. And without the Aeneid, you can't have Dante. And without Dante and the Aeneid, you can't have Paradise Lost.
Wow.
Like there's like, if you take out, this is kind of why I'm like, you rate it whatever you want, Mel. But it's like rating a mountain. Like the mountain don't care.
I wasn't expecting Homer or the Iliad to care what I thought.
Yeah.
Max and Paige and I were talking about what ratings we gave for each book. And
yeah.
Going through.
I'm sorry. I just need to interrupt because I just had 2 really important thoughts and I'm rude. Thought number 1, for the purposes of this project, if you don't have the Iliad and the Odyssey, then you lose a crap ton of Greek tragedies. So obviously a lot of Greek tragedies deal with other myth cycles, but some of the most significant Greek tragedies that were the best respected in their time and the prize-winning ones are they're not knockoffs of Homer, but they're responding to Homer. But then my more intense thought is that if you don't have the Iliad and the Odyssey, you never have Apollonius, who is a scholar of Homer, like one of the actual scholar nerds in the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. You never have him writing his Argonautica, things of the Argonaut, things of the Argo, which is Jason and the Golden Fleece. And without Jason and the Golden Fleece, and I'm not joking, you don't have Percy Jackson.
Oh.
Yeah.
You can't get rid of it, Mel. It's stuck.
It's incredible hubris of either of us to rate the Iliad. I am in no way pretending that, I have any right to do this. However, just from those things that I read out to you, character, atmosphere, writing, just thinking about that from a purely as a reader reading this book, not thinking about all the ramifications of where it fits in our universe and how important it is, not thinking about all those things, just as a reader reading this book like any other book. That's
So
where
not thinking about the fact that if you take out Homer from the Jenga block of Western literature, that the entire thing collapses. So sure, if we're not thinking about that, then you give it 3 stars.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah,
Okay.
pretty much. So yeah, exactly. Like if I don't think about the fact that without Homer, I wouldn't have the Lord of the Rings, which my entire childhood rests upon.
That's true. You literally wouldn't. You actually wouldn't
I
exist
wouldn't
as
exist.
we know you,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't either. Like if we think about how much the stories that we read as kids, especially, or absorb as kids, whether we read them or see them or whatever, like how
Yeah.
much they permeate us, we would be different people.
It's very, very true. So my incredible hubris of daring to write the Iliad aside, I was just going through my list of questions that I sent you.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the questions that I said, the first one I sent to you was, what is it about Briseis that modern readers seem to be so fascinated by? And then I wrote, or is that just me? To which Max responded, I think it's just you. Which
I've always been known for my tact.
which brings us to actually back to Ovid again, because
Sure.
I think that
It's because you've read
my
Heroides 3.
fascination with Briseis is actually from Ovid, and I should have said to Paige, we should have put that in this project, because
Yeah,
because
that would have been
I
great.
actually reread it the other day, and I was like, yeah, this should have been in the project, because Briseis is. So, do you want to explain what the Heroides
Sure.
are?
So Ovid, if anyone's listening and isn't aware, so Ovid is a Roman poet who's writing 20s, 10s BC, and then into the turn of the millennium. And one of the earliest things that he writes are a series of poems, letters from the perspectives of heroines, which is where the Heroides comes in. It literally is just the ancient Greek word for like women who do stuff, ancient heroines. And so he takes a bunch of mythological characters. Most of them are Greek, but not all of them. And he writes letters from their perspective to the significant men in their lives, almost all of whom are, they're all, the husbands or the boyfriends or the beloved, etc. And so I think it's letter number 3 is from Briseis to Achilles. And so it's Ovid, a Roman man, taking up the perspective of a Trojan captive or captive from around the area of Troy, writing to her Greek enslaver who she's kind of fallen in love with. So it's a bit of a Stockholm syndrome letter.
And I think that is my personal fascination with Briseis. And reading this is why I'm like, we probably should have thrown this in the mix, because reading Pat Barker, who obviously centered Briseis in The Silence of the Girls and The Women of Troy, it is fairly clear that she is somewhat aware of Briseis from the Heroides.
I think I remember we had a chat ages ago about some things that Natalie Haynes said in doing some of the press, I think, for the 1,000 Ships, on some of the stuff that was kind of in the blurb and the marketing materials that I had found a bit objectionable. And I didn't mind the book at all. I thought it was really interesting, but I thought that some of the way that was presented as a kind of groundbreaking treatment of, the perspectives of these women, I thought that was kind of over the top, because actually going back to Homer, we have Homer giving us insight into a lot of these women's perspectives. And then you have the Greek tragedians picking up on that in a huge way, particularly Euripides with his play The Trojan Women, among several others that he wrote about Trojan women, but not exclusively Euripides. Anyway, so I did think that was kind of, you can definitely say women haven't explored this, but to say these women have never been given a voice is not really true, except there are a few who really are almost entirely voiceless, but around whom the plot pivots. One of them is Lavinia in the Roman tradition of the Aeneid, and the other one is Briseis. And so, Mel, I think that it's a really good point that Briseis is not, she's not being given the voice that her position in the narrative warrants, because the Iliad basically
that women haven't been given a voice is not necessarily accurate. But to say that like a fairly important character in the structure of the story who happens to be a woman hasn't been given a voice. I mean, you could also argue that Patroclus could have been given a lot more voice as well. Like, obviously he is a bit more of a character, but like his experiences definitely are pivotal to the novel as well, or the story as well, and he, I feel like, was probably less central to the narrative than he could have been.
But
Yeah.
they're just friends.
Yeah, for example. But another thing that I find really interesting about Briseis, and I think that I must have, because I did study Ovid as part of my honours thesis, so that's why I'm like all about the Heroides and stuff. And I think that what I found really interesting in discussing that particular letter was that what was brought up is the way that that Briseis in this letter is very much almost parroting what Andromache says to Achilles in the Iliad about Achilles being mother, father, brother, sister. Since all of her family have died, he's the most pivotal. Sorry, Andromache doesn't say to Achilles. Andromache says to Hector.
To Hector,
Yeah, and then Ovid kind of takes that and then puts that into Briseis's letter to Achilles, and like kind of turns the whole concept on its head, because initially I feel like potentially Homer was using it as a way to, like, I don't know, it was kind of romantic, like, you are like so important to me because of this, and then to hear it coming from Briseis about her captor and rapist is quite full on. So I think that was something that always fascinated me. But also, like, Homer wrote that originally from Andromache's perspective. So to say that women didn't have a voice or didn't have a perspective in the Iliad, again, I don't think, like we said, is accurate. It just maybe isn't the one person that, like you said, none of this action would have even happened if we hadn't had her.
Yeah.
But the same could be said of Colchis. Who was the slave that was Achilles? Chryseis, sorry.
Hang on. So, no, that's okay. So Chryseis was Agamemnon's slave girl. Chryseis was the daughter of the priest of Apollo.
Yes.
And so when Chryseis was confiscated, sorry, that's a horrible word to use, but that's kind of how she's treated. When she's confiscated, the priest calls down the plague from Apollo. And so then Briseis is confiscated in return.
Yeah.
So it's the Chryseis, like, tandem confiscation. I think it's really valid to look back at any of, the canons of literature that have been predominantly constructed by any one set of people. So let's say in this case, constructed by men, or probably exclusively free men in slaveholding societies, as far as we can tell. And to say either there's no characters of this kind of social standing who speak, or when there are those characters, well, hang on a second, they're being voiced and characterized entirely from the perspective of the people in power. I think it's totally fair enough to say that, so I think it's fair enough to say, well, hang on, we've got Euripides' version of the Trojan women, let's have some women's versions of it. I think that's totally fair enough to say. It just kind of grates on me a little bit when people sort of sometimes infer that, like, these women have kind of been completely ignored, because that kind of silences them even more in a way, or it can miss the sexism with which they've been treated, which is actually really important. So, for example, Helen is in some texts made to take a huge amount of blame for her role in things, and she's used as an example of moral agency versus moral responsibility for hundreds of years in Greek philosophy. And so if you just say, oh, people didn't care what Helen thought, it's like, no, they did. That doesn't mean it wasn't sexist.
It's not the not listening to women. It's the what we do with who's speaking for them and what we do with what is said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go soon because it's about 10:30. But before I go, was there any thing that we haven't covered that you want to cover if we don't have another chat?
Well, I might end the recording part and then we can kind of say goodbye, because I'm sure Paige and I are going to have our own actual ending to our videos. So. Hello, everybody. It is the 27th of January and I need to put this video up today. I neglected completely to actually do an outro, despite
the fact that you will have literally just seen me say that both Paige and I will do an outro. I also haven't quite finished watching Paige's finished video. Sorry, Paige. So I don't know what Paige said in the end, but I'm sure that I agree with her. It was a fantastic experience. It was very interesting. I feel like we had a lot of fun. I certainly had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun getting Max and Paige's opinions and perspectives on what we were reading and what we were doing, and their thoughts on feminism and retellings in general. I apologise for the rushed nature of this outro, but like I said, I wanted to get this up today. But yeah, I had a really great time doing this project. We have discussed potentially doing a project similar but around the Odyssey, but we haven't figured out when. So if you're interested in seeing us do that or seeing anything like that from any of us, I guess, whether it's a collab or whether it's just me doing it or just me and Paige or just Paige, please let me or us know. But anyway, yeah, I'm going to wrap up now. So do all the things. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any thoughts, comments, opinions, comment all that down below. If you are interested in doing something similar with any kind of mythology, I guess, Greek or otherwise, or any other kind of like retellings that are coming up a lot. I know there's like a lot of Beauty and the Beast retellings, which are fantasy, which could be an interesting one to do as well. Let me know all of that in the comments below. I'd love to do something like that. I had a really good time, like I said. And yeah, if you'd like to leave me a comment but you don't know what, then leave me, I don't know, I guess some kind of fantasy / mythology type emoji. And like I said, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, give this video a thumbs up, go and subscribe to Paige, please. And yeah, that's everything I have to talk to you about today. Thank you for sticking around for such an incredibly long video if you did. And anyway, I'll talk to you all very soon. Bye!